Hi, I'm Edwin Samuelson, and welcome to Martin Scorsese Part 2. All right, well, let's begin. This film is a very, I guess you could say it's a very interesting film because we were talking earlier about Martin Scorsese's use of music in his films. This one is actually about music. Martin Scorsese was an editor on the very famous Woodstock, and this time he got to direct and edit his own film, The Last Waltz, with the group The Band. It was their final performance, and it was a very, very well-planned all-star affair with many guest people coming in, like Neil Diamond of all people. And it's considered one of the greatest rock and roll or music movies ever made. And I'm going to give this to you here because I'm not too familiar. I'm not a very big band fan, so it's hard for me to appreciate it.
It's a good movie. It's one of the better rock films, I guess. Stage concert films. And there's just so many great performances in it. Neil Young is just great. And there's that great story about how they shot him. He had a big rock of cocaine hanging from his nose. And in those days, they didn't have anything like digital special effects or stuff like that. So they literally had to go frame by frame by frame and touch out that rock of cocaine from his nose.
Really?
Yeah, most of the budget was spent doing that.
Oh my God! I would just cut the number out.
But it's just a great film. It's wonderful. In between all the concert footage, they have these great anecdotes and stories from members of the band, Robbie Robertson, all those guys. Robbie Robertson and Martin Scorsese were roommates in NYU, so they were old friends, and that's how he came to make The Last Waltz. And there was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot. So take it to someone else.
And Lee Von Helm actually didn't look that old compared to now, where he looks terribly old and terribly tragic, but he didn't look that bad in the movie, in The Last Waltz.
That's because he was younger when he made that movie.
That was 30 years ago.
The whole time-space continuum.
Don't forget.
Who else was a guest star in that? I've never seen The Last Waltz. I've never seen The Last Waltz.
Bob Dylan, who they will forget they were the backing band for Dylan in the '60s when he went electric.
Dr. John.
Dr. John. We said Neil Diamond.
Which I still can't believe.
Morrison.
Leave Neil Diamond alone, okay? Scorsese likes Neil Diamond.
Hey, I give Neil Diamond credit for one thing. He wrote one of the best songs ever, which is Heartlight, his heartfelt love to E.T. So any person who writes Heartlight, I give him respect.
I think Neil Diamond's got some good songs. I
Exactly.
think Cherry's a great song.
He's the Jewish Elvis for the old ladies.
He's good in The Last Waltz. There was a brief period there where he was kind of, he was doing good stuff, and that captures that right there. And then the rest of it's just, Neil Diamond would like to make fun of.
For more Neil Diamonds, he's saving Silverman. All right.
Oh,
well,
God, I can't believe you brought
I'm
that.
just kidding.
Please use your...
You just had to just keep picking on Neil Diamond, don't you?
Use your Final Cut Pro skills to remove that whole segment.
Hey, I'm sorry. Oh, shit, I forgot. I'm sorry. People, I take that back because Jack Black's in it. Take it back.
Last Waltz I enjoyed because I had heard the songs before but never knew who performed them. So I ended up becoming a really huge The Band fan. And I love the fact that pretty much after that, I noticed Scorsese started hiring Robbie Robertson as his musical supervisor for most of his films, which are why most of Scorsese's soundtracks, when it's not orchestral music, are usually so collectible because Robbie Robertson knows the time periods and the best songs to use, and all Martin has to come up with is the visuals.
Kind of like the way Mark Mothersbaugh does the soundtracks to Wes Anderson films.
True, but not as collectible as Scorsese's.
I would do anything to see Martin Scorsese do a film on the Rolling Stones because it's because of his love for
He
the Rolling
is doing a
Stones.
film on the Rolling Stones.
Oh,
That's his
he
next
is?
film. Yeah, he's gotten Albert Maysles to do some of the cinematography.
Oh, wow. I'm
That's
there.
his next film.
Because I love the Stones, and I know Martin does.
Rob Reiner in Spinal Tap, his character is sort of a sly parody of Martin Scorsese with The Last Waltz.
Martin DeBurgi.
Marty DeBurgi.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can't believe I never figured that out, even though it's obvious.
Well, now you know.
Now I know. Well, let's go on to our next film, which I think is another masterpiece. In fact, it's probably one of the most unusual films to be made because the character is completely unsympathetic. And this film is Raging Bull, which is the story of heavyweight fighter Jake LaMotta. Never has a lead character in a movie been so hateful and unremorseful. It's a very interesting, unsympathetic character, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, but I didn't dislike. I mean, I love Raging Bull.
I love it too.
In fact, for a long time, it was one of my favorite movies of all time. It was definitely my favorite Scorsese film for a while. I don't know why I don't pull it that way anymore. But I love Raging Bull. But it's like the things that you love about it are kind of cliche things everyone talks about. They really are some of the best boxing scenes ever shot.
Yeah, the sound
His
effects.
sense of
yeah.
choreography and
Beautiful
editing and
black and white.
everything, and the black and white
Beautiful black and
photography.
white.
Kathy Moriarty is just gorgeous and
Then-
so good in this film.
And we really get to see what Joe Pesci is going to
Joe
like
Pesci, right? Joe Pesci is
That
phenomenal. in this.
final argument that he has with his brother, unbelievable.
That's why I think the two
But
of
I
the
don't-
best performances.
And what's fascinating about the film is, it's a very unsympathetic portrait, and yet Jake LaMotta was pretty much there when they were making the film. You know,
And he hated the film afterwards. He said, "That's not me." And his wife said, "Yes, it is." And she was, and then he's finally learned to accept that that's who he really was. He really didn't like to see who he really was in person.
it's one of De Niro's best performances.
He gained all the weight, and I mean, everyone talks about
Incredible.
that, but it really is amazing to see him that heavy. He must have gained about
It almost
60
looks like
pounds.
makeup nowadays.
Probably.
You'd almost think it would look like makeup. But I disagree with you on the fact that you say that it's a hateful performance. Plays a hateful man. I think he plays a self-destructive person. This
Yes.
man can never achieve success. And yes, his behavior is completely aberrant. I mean, he acts like a thug and he's a bully and everything. But most of the time you're sitting there going, Jake, you have your whole life. You have, the world is your oyster, and you're destroying yourself, and you're destroying everyone around you. I mean, one of the most heartbreaking scenes is where he wraps his championship belt in a towel and just smashes out all the jewels. I mean, you're right there, you're just pulling your hair out. You're so frustrated with this guy. And the way that he treats the people around him, that he loves them and cares about them, but he's like such a... he has such a thug mentality, or not even a thug mentality, but such a self-destructive streak that you realize that he's going to not only go down the drain, but he's going to try and yank everybody else down with him. And I don't know if that makes him a hateful person, but it definitely makes him a severely flawed person.
It's one of the most unsettling scenes in the film for me. It's a terrific moment, is where you see De Niro, or I should say Jake LaMotta, in the jail cell just by himself and realizing that he's hit rock bottom. And you really feel it with him. The thing that I thought was very interesting, and the biggest accomplishment I think Scorsese and De Niro could do, is that they made a very horrible human being. He was horrible, but you were able not to sympathize with him, but you could understand the position. You didn't hate him. You were just there with him on the journey and watching him, and you felt bad for him, but you didn't condone what he did, but you accepted it.
Well, see, we can talk about Raging Bull and the great sequences all day, but the thing about Raging Bull that really, I guess, I started to notice at this point was this was also really the first time that Frank Vincent, who is usually in Scorsese's films, finally actually gets more of a little bit of a bigger role. I mean, he's not one of the major stars of the movie, but his role is significant in this movie. When, his real friend and best friend in real life, Joe Pesci, beats the hell out of him.
Yeah, that's a little joke. In the other movies, they kill each other in one movie, or they beat each one up. They take turns in other films.
Yes, because they were both like singer-songwriters at the time. That's how they supported themselves. So, but I mean, other than that, I think Raging Bull is excellent. We're still not up to what my favorite Scorsese is, but this is right behind it as my favorite Scorsese film.
Two things I got to mention too. I mean, we love this trivia, but it's a miracle that we were able to. I mean, we found amazing actor Joe Pesci, and it was by accident where they were talking. They could not find an actor for this movie. They were looking everywhere to play. They wanted a brother, of support for Robert De Niro, and that is the most important part of the movie, is the relationship between the two characters. That's what makes the movie work for me. De Niro was watching a UHF channel one night, and he saw a movie called Death Enforcer, which is a really low-budget movie made in Jersey, like a little low-rent mafia movie. And it had Frank Vincent and Joe Pesci in it, and that's how Joe Pesci got discovered. He didn't even want to go back into acting. They had to force him into it. He goes, I gave it up. I don't want to do it anymore. And then he did it, and he's become very successful. And sadly, I don't know where the hell he is.
Yeah, well, they need to do it again.
There is Joe Pesci.
What's interesting too, that was his first Scorsese flick, and that's like his most sympathetic character he got to play, because from that point on, he always played the psychopath.
Yes, he plays the Jake LaMotta character basically in his other films. And
Well, Joe Pesci, after a series of many movies in the 90s, after he got the critical attention from a film we'll mention later, Goodfellas, and from Casino. He did a series of movies, and then he just put himself in self-imposed exile. And I guess once you make it, as much money as he did, he just took himself out of the spotlight. I think he started doing music again, like lounge singing or whatever.
Actually, he's doing rap.
Yeah, my guess is he thought,
Was his last film the last Lethal Weapon
Yes,
movie?
it was.
yeah, and
He got
he's
paid a
going
fortune
to
for
be, Pesci is going to be making a comeback here in Robert De Niro's film about the CIA called The Good Shepherd.
I
He
love
was so good in Michael Jackson's Moonwalk.
As the
agree.
drug dealer.
It's so funny too is that we're talking about him in Raging Bull. He actually went on to have a somewhat decent career afterwards, and then he was had steady work. He was not really big, and then when Goodfellas came out, he became a lead. So it took him like 10 years, but he became a lead, and I love Joe Pesci. And and there's one thing else I'd like to mention about Raging Bull before we close. I love you were talking earlier on another show about the color footage, the home movies in Mean Streets. I love the little montage in the middle of Raging Bull of the color home footage, the home movies. I think that's really well done, and you're talking about his detail, the attention to the time period. That's a wonderful representation since they didn't use music.
True.
All right, well, this next film of Scorsese's, which we'll get to in a second here, is at the time was a failure, a very big failure. It's a very sad story because the person who wrote the screenplay and tried to submit it. No one was interested, and then he killed himself. But then, of course, it gets made, just like Leaving Las Vegas. The film is The King of Comedy, which stars, again, Martin Scorsese's favorite actor, Robert De Niro, as this time is what would you say, a wannabe
Before Leonardo DiCaprio.
Talk show host wannabe.
Right, talk show
And
host.
Not just a comedian,
A
not
wannabe.
just a radio host, but he wanted to be Johnny Carson. Rupert Pupkin.
I love that name.
Pupkin.
I love that name, Rupert Pupkin. I mean, how could you forget a name like that?
Mr. Pumpkin? No, that's Pupkin. Pupkin.
And it's a very unusual performance by De Niro.
Yes, but this film I have a lot to finally say about because
Please.
this was the first Scorsese film I ever saw in my life, and it was actually on television. And I liked it so much, but I knew there was a lot of bleeping out of stuff that I had to go out and get the video cassette just so I could see this film. And I mean, I just loved it. It also was like my first exposure to also kind of satire, sort of making fun of things, because first of all, it has Tony Randall in it. And anytime I see Tony Randall in a movie, I'm happy. Well, used to see Tony Randall in a movie. He doesn't make any movies anymore.
Not from heaven.
Well, if you think that's where he is.
And he's very good in the movie, isn't he, Tony Randall?
Exactly, because I guess he's playing a version of himself as a prick. I don't know how Tony Randall is in real life. I never got to meet him. I would have liked to. But also in the film, it also first exposed me to Sandra Bernhard. And I remember watching the film as a child and not really trying to figure out, is she attractive or not?
She was in that movie, I think.
Well, yeah, that's you.
No, but very sexy. Not necessarily attractive. I think there's two different things. She was sexy, though.
And that's a hard performance. You gotta give her credit. That performance she pulled off to be this really mean, crazy woman.
Well, she was a stalker.
Yeah, I mean, she was crazy. I mean, she was mean, but
And
she
she
pulls
made it
off.
funny.
She made it funny. There's a scene where she's seducing
And
Jerry
passionate.
Lewis.
Yeah, and passionate.
Which is great.
It's a classic scene.
And there's another thing I want to mention too. This film could take place in the comedy world of Taxi Driver, I would believe. And this to me feels like his representation of his response to the whole John Hinckley incidents, with the stalking and the kidnapping, because Jerry Lewis plays a talk show host who is the Johnny Carson, and Rupert Pupkin wants his job, and he will do anything
Jerry
to take
Lewis
it.
is amazing in this
A
film.
little bit of trivia here.
I know what you're going to mention.
It was supposed to be Johnny Carson that was supposed to be in
That I
the
did not
role of the talk show host that is kidnapped by Sandra Bernhard and Rupert Pupkin. It was supposed to be Johnny Carson. Scorsese wanted Carson. Carson says, no, I can't do that.
And I think I know why he didn't want to do it, because I don't know if you're familiar with the John Hinckley case. He had a list of 3 celebrities he was going to kill. Johnny Carson and David Bowie were also on that list, in addition
That's
to John
interesting.
Lennon.
I
Well,
didn't know
also Johnny Carson at the time also had his own stalker who would send him videotapes of him interviewing Johnny Carson and then beating him over the head with a bat on tape. So
David Letterman too had the lady who cut off her, put her head down on the train track. It's a weird world if you're a talk
But-
Stalkers of talk show hosts.
But the thing I also find interesting with this film is I guess when Robert De Niro finally gets his time on television, sorry for spoiling that, but you know, his whole stand-up act is so kind of depressing and just, you know, self-deprecating to the character. I just found that interesting because at the time, I don't know, I didn't know stand-up comedy back then, so, you know, I had never seen anything like that. And I also, a little bit of trivia that I found out was that to get Jerry Lewis angry in scenes when Jerry Lewis didn't feel like he could do the scenes, like especially the scene at his house, what De Niro would do is whisper in his ear anti-Semitic remarks to piss Jerry Lewis off so that he would really hate him in those scenes.
And it worked.
Exactly. And, you know, I found that interesting that even during the filming, De Niro, even though Jerry Lewis had made all these films over the years, I guess he didn't feel comfortable in dramatic work, and that, you know, he quietly had, you know, Robert De Niro kind of coaching him through it throughout the whole film. So I found that little tidbit interesting.
And the reason why you brought this up earlier, the reason why it was a failure is, I hate to say it, but
It's too dark.
it's not a comedy. It's called King of Comedy, people, but it's not a comedy. And at the time, people thought they were going to see a funny movie. It's not that funny. I mean, it's kind of funny, but in a very odd way. It's a very dark and it's a very odd film. And it also goes on, like Jeff said, that it goes on to really flesh out the whole idea of satire, but it also really pokes fun and takes a piss out of our media culture and the cult of personality.
The 15 minutes of fame and
how that's exploited towards the
it's
end.
ahead of its time in that respect.
And to see this character who's demented and has a very, very narrow worldview of things, very focused for all the wrong reasons, and to have his wish fulfilled by the end it's a very stunning portrayal of how you can access the cult of personality through your darkest fantasies and have it come true.
You know what? You just made me want to see it again. I'm going to watch it tonight when I get home.
And there's a cameo by
But
The Clash.
The Clash, one of my favorite groups of all time. Joe Strummer and Mick Jones in the background. Look for them. And we'll get to a little bit more of The Clash on a later Martin Scorsese film coming up. But this was King of Comedy was Martin Scorsese, I guess you could say, his first attempt at a comedy in his films, even though it's not really, you know. But his next film, I guess you could say, was his first foray into real comedy. And after the very depressing failure of King of Comedy, Scorsese drifted into drugs and was a hardcore substance abuser. His friend Robbie Robertson came to him and helped him clean up and said, I want to get you out there working and let's have fun. And he brought him a script. It was called After Hours. And After Hours was a film, was produced for like around $5 million by the David Geffen Company and Robbie Robertson. And it follows Griffin Dunne on a very interesting night in the city of New York. To say any more, it's a very funny and very bizarre film, and it has many appearances by the great and probably one of the funniest people on earth, Catherine O'Hara.
Oh,
and
brilliant.
Also,
Brilliant.
Don't forget one of my favorites, Cheech and Chong. And
well, they have a very tiny cameo.
but their cameo actually is a very important one because it plays a part of the movie. And let's not forget Linda Florentino and the great Rosanna Arquette.
Rosanna Arquette.
And
then all the other Scorsese bit players in it all over.
Oh,
Victor Argo.
And don't forget the
Victor
don't
Argo
forget
as the diner owner.
Don't forget that's not him.
John Hurt?
That's Dick Miller.
No, Victor Argo is the guy at the diner.
No, the diner who
brings
gives him the hamburger.
Yeah, brings him the hamburger.
That's
like,
Dick Miller.
No, that's
Dick
Victor
Miller,
Argo.
that's
Victor Argo.
That's Victor Argo.
We'll check on that. I'm damn sure it's Dick
That's
Miller.
Victor
You have
Argo.
two people
Dick
telling
Miller.
you it's Victor
Dick
Argo.
We'll check on IMDb.
I think
people.
Dick
I
Miller
don't
might be his
remember.
nickname.
Well, I just remember because Dick Miller. I was like, oh my God, that's Dick Miller, and he brings up. He goes, here's your hamburger. Or
No, that's
whatever.
Victor Argo.
It's Victor
We'll
Argo.
check
Because it
tonight.
was like 3 hours later. That's one of the best scenes in the movie is he orders a hamburger and a coffee, he has nobody, he has to leave, comes back 3 hours later.
And it's Dick Miller, right?
And
It's Victor Argo.
We'll debate that later.
Yeah, you get, no,
All right.
there's no debate.
I will add a
It's
subtitle.
Victor
You,
Argo.
sir, have the right to your own
I will-
opinion. You don't have the right to your own facts.
Well, let's not get. I will add a subtitle to say who's correct and wrong, and if I'm wrong, I won't put it. But no, I'm kidding. I'll put it anyway. But anyway, this is a very interesting film. I think it's probably the most unique film in Scorsese's filmography.
I agree.
Because it's a very weird.
Just because I want to agree.
To me, it's Scorsese doing Terry Gilliam in a way. I mean, it's a very off the wall.
Yeah, I was going to say,
I
when
think
you
it's
said that you
more-
thought Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore was kind of unusual for Scorsese. I think
It is
After
unusual.
Hours was very unusual.
I think
the way it's
for
shot, the
Scorsese.
way it's edited, it feels. I mean, this feels more like a comedy than King of Comedy did, and this is still a pretty dark film. But
See, I think it's more like almost like a John Landis type film.
It is. In fact, what's so funny about this film is that
Into
it
the
inspired
Night.
all these kind of pseudo ripoffs, like John Landis did in Into the Night, which is basically After Hours.
It's the same year though, which is so weird.
Yeah, and then you had Adventures in Babysitting, which is basically After Hours for teenagers.
Oh,
you
I
know?
agree.
Well,
100%
this
on that.
all
And-
started that whole everything happens in one night.
Right.
And
Which isn't a bad genre. It's actually sort of a compelling idea, but it's such a good film.
And it
It's
does
so
a great.
funny
It does a great job, doesn't it, of capturing the New York nightlife? It
Yeah,
really does.
it's-
of that time
and,
period.
and that really glossy, high on what would you say?
Artsy
Low on
fartsy?
substance, high on visual, not visual, but just really like very superficial, very superficial Soho, super artsy
Yes.
fartsy crowd or whatever. It's like
Perfect.
that post new wave, too cool for school
And
New York attitude.
Griffin Dunn is the perfect yuppie of the 80s.
The foil. He's the
perfect.
one most wonderful foil.
And the film has a lot of energy.
Yes, and it's a very short-paced film. I mean, it's a very short film, but it really just moves. I mean, it keeps going. It's only 90
Griffin
minutes.
Dunn is a wonderful straight man in the film. Wonderful straight man. When I think it's Rosanna Arquette gives him the phone number, and it's only got 6 numbers, and he says that out loud. He's like, "Okay, it's only 6 numbers, but we can work with this." And it's great. But like you mentioned earlier, when you introduced the film, if for anything to see, there would be nothing in this film if for only Catherine O'Hara and her ice cream truck is so phenomenal.
I love Catherine O'Hara. I think she's probably one of the most underrated comedians of all time. And case in point, see SCTV. Her impersonation
She's
is
like,
amazing.
to me,
She's
she's
getting
like
a
right
lot
up
of
there
work
with
now.
Lucille Ball, I think.
Yeah.
I love her. I really do. I mean, I have so much more respect for her after I saw her on SCTV. I mean, I really began to appreciate it. But her part is not the biggest, but it's really terrific. And
So memorable.
And
All
John
the-
Hurt is great in it.
Yes,
too, as
I
a
forgot he's in
bartender,
it.
and
well,
who turns out to be the boyfriend of.
there was one scene that is great. A scene with a $20 bill, which I love very much, which plays throughout the entire movie with Griffin Dunn. Where he loses $20. I think that's a very amusing little
Paper
thing.
mache, that's all I have to say.
Yes.
Paper mache.
All right, well, let's get on to our next film because this show is almost over.
How is that possible?
We're enjoying talking about Scorsese. Hey, the guy deserves a show, 3 shows.
If we could do 2 parts of Tom Cruise, folks, we're doing 3 parts of Scorsese.
Well, let's go to this one. Some people consider this Martin Scorsese's sellout. I don't know because he's able to bring some style to it. Jeff, I'm going to give this one to you because I know you know the movie. It's the 1986 Color of Money, which is the sequel to The Hustler with Paul Newman and Tom Cruise. Please take it away. We're talking about Tom Cruise, so there you go.
Okay,
Talk
The
about it.
Color of Money, despite a very good performance from Tom Cruise and Paul Newman finally winning the Oscar, I believe, for this film, I like it more for, again, the supporting players because this was also early John Turturro, early Forrest Whitaker, or early Keith David, or is it David Keith? I always get them confused.
Keith David is the
The
man
white
for
guy
Thing.
and David Keith.
David
the black
Keith
guy.
is from the...
Okay, so the black guy was in this film. But also,
Keith.
here was what I was talking about.
No, I'm sorry, it is Keith David.
Okay,
He's the
Keith
black
David,
guy.
see? You don't know. Either.
Dick Miller. It's Dick
No,
Miller.
Well,
no,
yeah, no.
Dick Miller was not in this film, nor was Victor Argo. But I will say that this is where also what I was talking about earlier, powerful female performance. Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, isn't that a mouthful? Last time I really saw her in a major role, last time she was also really sexy on screen. But I love this film. People can call it a sellout, can say he was selling out. I find it he was updating more of a classic instead of remaking a classic, which is what I appreciate.
That classic would be The Hustler.
The Hustler. And I also liked even the pre-credit sequence where it's Martin Scorsese narrating, talking about the game of pool and how it can relate to life. And I just love, I'm an unabashed Martin Scorsese fan. He is my all-time favorite director. I know how cliche that sounds for a film fan, but I truly love Martin Scorsese because when I first started watching films really a lot, I found that me and him had similar backgrounds, both didn't play a lot as children, watched films to kind of get away from the real world, and
Both raised as young black kids.
Well, he grew up in Little Italy in his own community. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in my own, one of a kind community. But that is why for my whole life, anytime Martin Scorsese makes anything or a book comes out on Martin Scorsese, I read it, pay attention to it. My dream one day is just to hopefully just meet him You know, I don't even have to have a long conversation. Just meeting him would be just the ultimate goal in my whole life.
Oh, well, hey, go to the talk shows and get tickets. He usually sometimes is there as a guest. He was just on Conan recently promoting, I think, another film which we'll be talking about later. I think Color Money is not a bad film. I think it's not one of his. I think it's one of the first really. I'm not gonna say it's a weak film. It's the first film of his, which to me is just not like super special.
I'll tell you, I'll agree. I'll come out and say it. I think it's a rather weak film. I mean,
I don't think it's weak. I think it's
I think
Paul Newman is
compared
terrific.
to his other
Okay, I was
stuff.
about to say compared to his other stuff, but
Because,
even his weak
le-
stuff
But you know,
is better than
I'm just going to
half
say
stuff out
though,
there.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Hustler is a really good film in itself.
It's a masterpiece.
Is it Roger
Well,
Rosen,
supposedly
Roger Rosen?
Color of
What's-
Money is
Robert
the
Rossen.
sequel to The Hustler. It's
Yeah,
not
it's
like
Directed.
a,
No, it is a
not-
sequel. But what I was going
Right.
to say, Scorsese was an inspired choice to direct the sequel to The Hustler.
Well, he was a big fan of The Hustler.
And you know, Paul Newman's character, Fast Eddie, you know, that was an inspire. It was just inspired to explore that character at that time of his life. And while the kind of a plot about, you know, the whole idea about the veteran, you know, working with the upstart, you know, trying to smooth him and turn him, you know, take some rock and turn him into a stone, you know, and then what happens there is kind of a cliche story. I think it's just a very well made film. I don't know. I mean, I would say that I liked it better than, say, Gangs in New York.
Ooh, we'll get
it's
to
a
that
much
later.
I think for me it had a lot to do with being grabbed by the story, and I simply was not grabbed by the story. But I will say that stylistically, it's a very good-looking film.
It's a very 80s
but the
film.
story,
Tom
the
Cruise.
story.
Oh.
No.
We're out of time, people.
He does play the angry young man, which he does so well.
Sorry, we're out of time, but we will continue part 3 of the Martin Scorsese
Okay.
Chronicles with his next film, which would be The Last Temptation of Christ. So tune in for that. Anyway, until next week, take care. But yeah, I Color of Money, I think it's an interesting film. I think the performance by
Well, let's
Newman is
let's
awesome.
say good or bad, all of Scorsese. We should have that as a waiver. Good or bad, all of Scorsese's films are interesting films.
I don't, he hasn't done, he's only done one.